It is the autumn of 1943. A French railway worker moves through the freight yard at Troyes with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done the same job for 20 years. He is unremarkable in every particular. Heavy coat, grease-stained hands, a cigarette burning down to nothing between his lips. He pauses beside the boiler housing of a German supply locomotive, crouches as if checking a coupling, and in a single fluid motion presses something against the underside of the engine. The action takes less than 4 seconds. The object left behind is smaller than a pencil. It weighs roughly 30 grams, about as much as a small handful of coins. The worker walks away. He does not run, he does not look back. He crosses the yard and disappears into the dark. 11 hours later, as a Wehrmacht supply convoy moves through occupied France, the locomotive erupts. The explosion tears through the engine's firebox and sends a column of scalding steam skyward that can be seen from 3 kilometers away. The supply carriages jackknife across the track. Fuel, munitions, and equipment earmarked for the Eastern Front lie scattered across the embankment. German engineers will spend 4 days clearing the line. Military police will comb the yard at Troyes, interview workers, study the wreckage, and find nothing. Nothing, because what destroyed that locomotive left no evidence of tampering, no wires, no visible mechanism, no fuse, nothing that could be traced to any man or any workshop. What the German investigators did not know, and what the Third Reich would spend years failing to understand, was that the device responsible was not a bomb, in any traditional sense. It was a precision timing instrument. It was utterly immune to electronic jamming. It was accurate regardless of whether it sat in a sub-zero winter night or a sun-baked summer afternoon. And it had been developed not in a conventional armaments factory, but in a requisitioned country house in Buckinghamshire, by a team of engineers who reported directly to Winston Churchill himself. This is the story of the El Delay switch, officially designated the switch number 9, and of the British clockmaker's instinct that made it the most quietly devastating sabotage weapon of the Second World War. To understand why the El Delay mattered, you first have to understand the problem it was designed to solve. By 1940, Britain's newly formed Special Operations Executive, the SOE, had been handed an extraordinary mandate. Churchill's directive was simple in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. Set Europe ablaze. The SOE was to organize, supply, and coordinate resistance networks across occupied territory, sabotaging German infrastructure wherever possible. Railways, bridges, fuel depots, supply convoys, these were the targets. Disrupting the flow of material to the front was, in theory, a way to fight the war without fighting it directly. The challenge was delivery. The men and women being asked to carry out this sabotage were not trained combat engineers. They were teachers, shop owners, laborers, former soldiers, and clerks, brave but largely untrained in demolition. You could not ask a schoolteacher in Lyon to configure a complex timed explosive without weeks of instruction. And even if you trained them thoroughly, the problem of the fuse remained. The existing British solution was the number 10 delay switch, an early time pencil that used a simple chemical mechanism. A small glass vial of cupric chloride, housed inside a brass tube roughly the size of a writing pencil, sat above a thin, restraining wire. When an agent activated the device by crushing the copper section, the corrosive liquid was released. It began to eat through the wire. When the wire snapped, a spring-loaded striker was released against a percussion cap, which detonated the attached explosive. The delay, in theory, gave the agent time to escape. In theory. The reality was considerably less reassuring. The corrosive liquid was profoundly sensitive to temperature. In warm conditions, the acid worked faster than expected, shortening the delay to the point of killing the very agent who had planted the device. In cold conditions, the reaction slowed dramatically, sometimes stopping altogether. Declassified SOE documentation would later confirm what agents already knew in the field. The number 10 was dangerously unreliable. To compensate, agents were instructed to use 2 or 3 pencils simultaneously for a single charge, hoping at least one would function within the correct window. This doubled and tripled the risk of detection during placement. Agents died because their own devices went off too soon. Others planted charges that never detonated at all, leaving them liable to discovery by German patrols. The Germans had also begun adapting. By late 1942, Wehrmacht logistics officers had developed procedures for sweeping freight yards and supply depots with radio frequency detection equipment, searching for electronic timing mechanisms. Any device that relied on clockwork, electric circuits, or radio-controlled triggers was, in principle, detectable. The SOE needed something that could not be swept, could not be jammed, and could not betray itself through any signal that German equipment might pick up. They needed a timer that used no electricity whatsoever, that was immune to every countermeasure Germany had developed, and that would work at precisely the same speed whether it was planted in Norway in December or North Africa in August. That requirement, framed in those terms, was not a technical brief. It was a riddle. The man who solved it was Major Millis Jeffers of MD1, operating out of a commandeered country house called The Firs in Whitchurch near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. MD1, Ministry of Defense 1, was Churchill's personal weapons laboratory, answerable to no bureaucracy except the Prime Minister himself. It was known, with affectionate irreverence, as Churchill's toy shop. Jeffers was a Royal Engineers sapper with deep experience in explosives and a mind that approached mechanical problems with the relentlessness of a man who fundamentally disliked being told that something was impossible. The solution Jeffers arrived at was one of elegant, almost maddening simplicity. Instead of using a chemical reaction to corrode a wire, a process governed by temperature and the unpredictable behavior of acid, he looked to the properties of metal under sustained mechanical stress. The relevant phenomenon is known as creep. When certain metal alloys are placed under a constant load, they do not simply stretch uniformly. They deform slowly, predictably, at a rate governed almost entirely by the composition of the metal rather than by external conditions. A lead alloy, Jeffers found, was extraordinarily susceptible to this phenomenon. A piece of notched lead wire placed under tension by a spring-loaded striker and held in place by nothing more than its own structural integrity would gradually elongate until it snapped at the notch, releasing the striker. The mathematics of creep, applied to a precisely calibrated lead alloy, meant that the time to failure could be determined in advance with considerable accuracy. The diameter of the notch set the delay. Notch it to one specification and the wire snapped in 10 minutes. Notch it to another specification and the process took 24 hours. The delay could be set from a matter of minutes to several days, covering the full range of tactical requirements that SOE agents encountered in the field. The finished device, the switch, number 9, or L delay, measured roughly 15 centimeters in length and weighed approximately 30 grams. It consisted of a small aluminum tube with a colored band indicating the delay period. Each color corresponded to a specific duration: red for 10 minutes, white for 1 hour, blue for several hours, and so on up the scale. The agent simply noted the color, removed the safety pin, and the clock was running. No crushing, no acid, no vials that might leak prematurely in a coat pocket, just metal under tension, slowly, inevitably, doing what physics required it to do. The device paired with the SOE's magnetic clam mine, itself another MD1 creation, to produce a weapon system of extraordinary elegance. The clam was a bakelite shell shaped like a shallow, rounded box, roughly the size of a large bar of chocolate. At each end sat powerful permanent magnets. The agent pressed the clam against any flat iron or steel surface, a locomotive boiler, a fuel tanker, a bridge support, and it locked on with a force that could not be shifted by vibration or accidental contact. Into the top recess, the agent inserted the L delay and a standard detonator. The whole assembly was concealed in seconds and could be planted while appearing to do something entirely routine, like crouching to inspect a wheel or leaning against a wall. Production of the L delay was carried out primarily at Station 12, Aston House near Stevenage in Hertfordshire, under the direction of Colonel Leslie Wood. The facility produced over the course of the war approximately 12 million time pencil detonators, a figure that encompasses both the chemical number 10 variants and the L delay type. Exact production numbers for the L delay specifically remain classified or have not been preserved in accessible records, but the scale of the overall operation indicates a level of industrial commitment that belied the device's diminutive appearance. What followed the distribution of the L delay across occupied Europe is a story assembled from fragments, field reports, post-war testimonies, and the laconic entries of SOE operational records, many of which remain partially redacted. Benjamin Coburn, one of SOE's most decorated F-section agents and the head of the Tinker network operating around Troyes, provides one of the most vividly documented examples of what the device could achieve when placed in skilled hands. In a single night's operation, Coburn and his network attached charges using L delays set for a delayed detonation that would fire hours after the team had cleared the area, to 6 German railway locomotives simultaneously. All 6 detonated. The effect on German supply movements through that sector was significant, delaying rail traffic for days. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisan forces found the L delay particularly suited to their operational environment. The Balkans were crisscrossed with the rail lines that connected Germany's forces across the region, and those lines were notoriously difficult to guard along their full length. A partisan who could approach a locomotive, plant a clam, and walk away without triggering any alarm was infinitely harder to neutralize than one who needed to physically blow up a section of track. Records of specific Yugoslav operations involving the L delay remain sparse. The nature of partisan warfare meant that documentation was often minimal, but SOE mission assessments cite repeated successful attacks on supply lines throughout 1943 and 1944. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In France, Norway, Poland, and Belgium, the pattern repeated itself. Agents who had received only basic training in the use of the device could plant it successfully in under a minute. The absence of any electronic component meant that German detection sweeps consistently came back negative. Wehrmacht investigators, confronted with a wrecked locomotive or a demolished fuel depot, would find no trace of a triggering mechanism because there was none. Only metal fatigue, completing its work long after the saboteur had gone home to supper. The psychological dimension was considerable. German security services, unable to explain the mechanism behind a succession of apparently spontaneous explosions, spent significant resources hunting for saboteurs who were, in operational terms, invisible. The sense that any locomotive, any fuel truck, any supply depot could be carrying a device that no instrument could detect created a diffuse anxiety in German logistics units that had real operational consequences. Germany had its own sabotage and delayed fuse programs, and the comparison is instructive. German special operations units used several types of delay fuses, most of which relied on variants of the clockwork mechanism. A small wound spring driving a gear train that released a striker at a predetermined interval. These devices were in many respects more precise than early British chemical pencils. A well-made clockwork timer, wound correctly and not interfered with, would fire at almost exactly the right moment regardless of temperature. German sabotage operations in Britain, conducted through agents handled by the Abwehr, deployed these devices with some operational success in the early war years. However, the clockwork mechanism had intrinsic vulnerabilities. The gearing required physical winding, which took time and produced sound, both significant liabilities in a covert insertion. Moving parts were susceptible to mechanical failure if the device was dropped, compressed, or exposed to significant vibration, which was an issue when planting charges on rail infrastructure, and, crucially, moving metallic parts produced a faint but detectable magnetic signature. German clockwork timers were, in principle, susceptible to the same detection techniques that Germany itself was applying to suspected Allied sabotage devices. The Americans, after Pearl Harbor, developed their own adaptation of the British chemical time pencil for use by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's counterpart to the SOE. The Unjammable chemical delay firing device was closely modeled on the British number 10, using the same acid wire corrosion principle. OSS documentation specified a reliable operating temperature range of approximately -1 to 32 degrees Celsius, a significant constraint that excluded the device from effective use in the more extreme climates of occupied Europe's winters. The L delay, by contrast, was governed by the physics of metal creep rather than chemical reaction. While it was not entirely immune to temperature effects, very extreme cold could marginally slow the process. Its performance variation across the normal range of European operational temperatures was far smaller than that of any chemical device. It was not perfect. Nothing in this story is perfect. But it was demonstrably superior to the alternatives available, and the Germans never produced anything that directly matched it. Interestingly, post-war analysis of captured German documents suggest that German intelligence was aware that British sabotage devices had become more reliable and harder to detect by 1943, but never definitively identified the mechanism responsible. The L delay remained in effect a secret that the enemy could observe the consequences of without ever fully comprehending the cause. How does one assess the true impact of a weapon designed to leave no trace? It is, by nature, a question that resists clean answers. SOE post-war records, along with the detailed testimonies of surviving agents, point to sustained disruption of German railway supply lines across occupied Europe throughout the middle and later years of the war. Rail sabotage was, as one operational assessment noted, among the highest return activities available to resistance networks. Lines were difficult to guard along their full length, required only small explosive charges to disable, and produced delays that rippled through the entire logistics chain that kept German forces supplied. The figure of 30 supply line destructions, used in describing this device's legacy, reflects not a single dramatic operation, but the cumulative effect of a campaign fought in fragments. One locomotive, one fuel depot, one bridge pylon at a time. Precise documentation is, by design, incomplete. The SOE's own records were partially destroyed at the end of the war, a precaution to protect surviving agents and networks. What remains is enough to confirm the scale of disruption without always providing the specific details that documentary history would prefer. What is not in doubt is the device's influence on subsequent thinking. The principle of the L delay, a mechanical timer requiring no electricity, no chemistry, and no moving parts susceptible to interference, was recognized after the war as genuinely novel. The observation in declassified Wikipedia-era analysis that pencil detonators of this type are, by nature, completely immune to detection or jamming via electronic countermeasures or EMP devices is not a retrospective compliment. It is a statement of physical fact that remains true today. The concept has outlasted the war that produced it. Surviving examples of both the number 10 chemical time pencil and the L delay can be examined at the Imperial War Museum in London, where several examples are held in the collection. The museum's records describe the yellow-banded variant as indicating a 6.5-hour delay, one of the longer settings available, suitable for an agent who needed to be well clear of a target area before dawn. There is something disquieting about the simplicity of it. We tend to imagine the great technological achievements of the Second World War as things of scale and complexity: the Lancaster bomber, the convoy radar, the code-breaking machinery at Bletchley Park. These were instruments of industrial civilization turned to war's purposes, requiring vast resources and thousands of skilled hands. The L delay required a notch in a piece of wire, That is, in the end, what distinguished it. Not the manufacturing precision, though that was real. Not the theoretical elegance of Jeffress's insight into metal creep, though that was real too. What distinguished it was the recognition that the problem of clandestine timing was not a problem that required more technology. It required less. The German detectors could sweep for electricity. They could sweep for radio signals. They could sweep for the faint magnetic signature of moving clockwork. They could not sweep for the molecular behavior of a lead alloy under stress because that was not a signal. It was simply physics, operating in silence, in darkness, on the underside of a locomotive that was already moving. Consider what the device demanded of its user. No training beyond a brief instruction, no tools, no wires to connect, no pins to set on a clock face. Remove the safety pin. Note the color. Walk away. An agent who had never handled an explosive in their life could deploy this weapon effectively. That accessibility was not a concession to simplicity. It was, in operational terms, a decisive advantage. The resistance was not made up of engineers. It was made up of human beings who were frightened and careful and resolute. A weapon they could use without thinking about it was a weapon they could actually use. Major Millis Jeffress, the Royal Engineers sapper who solved the problem of the unjammable timer, received relatively little public recognition during his lifetime. MD1, Churchill's toy shop, was disbanded at the end of the war, its records dispersed, its staff returned to civilian life or reassigned. The weapons it had produced were, by nature, difficult to commemorate. You cannot build a monument to a timing device that worked by being invisible. But the consequences of that invisibility, the supply lines broken, the convoys immobilized, the logistics chains that frayed and failed across occupied Europe, are part of the margin by which the war was won. 12 million pencil detonators, 30 supply lines, 1 notch in a wire. The clockmaker's instinct, applied to war, produced a weapon the Germans could never find, because there was nothing, in the end, to find. Only metal, doing what metal does, in the dark, beneath a locomotive, long after the man who placed it had walked home.